I lost my job in less than 2 hours, all because I chose to help a crying child. What I didn't know back then, what I couldn't have possibly guessed as I knelt on that cold, polished marble floor, was that the little girl gripping my hand like a lifeline belonged to the most dangerous man in Korea. And somehow, against every rule of his world and mine, that man became obsessed with me. If I had just walked away that day, if I'd been colder, harder, more like the city around me, my life would have been safer, but I wouldn't have met him. The morning started with so much hope. You know that feeling when you've been struggling for months, counting every one, and you finally land a break. Amaka stood in the center of the Lotte luxury department store, her uniform crisp, or her heart racing with the kind of nervous energy that makes your fingertips tingle. This was it, a fresh start in a foreign land. But the air in those places, it's thin, it's expensive, it's a world built on the idea that if you can't afford to be there, you're invisible. Then she heard it, a small, jagged sob cutting through the silence of the VIP wing. While the elite shoppers walked past, eyes fixed forward as if the sound of a suffering child was beneath their notice, Amaka felt that familiar tug in her chest. Compassion is a heavy thing to carry when you're poor. Her manager's voice echoed in her head. Do not leave your post. The rules are the only thing keeping you here. But then she saw her, little Sumi, tucked into a corner behind a display of $1,000 silk scarves, her face red from crying, her small shoulders shaking. In that moment, the job didn't matter. The visa didn't matter. Amaka knelt. She didn't see a billionaire's heir. She saw a scared little girl. She took Sumin's hand, whispered words of comfort in a mix of English and broken Korean, and promised she wouldn't leave until they found her father. But the world of the ultra-rich doesn't reward kindness. 10 minutes later, her manager found them. He didn't care about the child's safety. He cared about the unauthorized abandonment of a station. The coldness in his eyes was sharper than any blade. Pack your things, you're done. Just like that, the dream was over. Amaka walked out of those revolving doors with nothing but a bruised heart and a sense of defeat that felt like lead in her shoes. She didn't see the black sedan idling at the curb. She didn't see the man inside, Kang Joon-Seok, a man whose name was spoken in whispers, a man who controlled empires with a flick of his wrist. He was a shadow in a tailored suit, his eyes cold and predatory, scanning the crowd for the daughter he'd momentarily lost. When Amaka brushed past him, her eyes still wet with frustrated tears, she didn't bow, she didn't shrink. She walked with the fierce, quiet dignity of someone who knew she'd done the right thing, even if it cost her everything. And in that split second, Joon-Seok saw her. He didn't just see a woman, he saw a disruption, a glitch in his perfectly controlled universe. He watched her walk away, fascinated by the way she carried her poverty like armor, unaware that within 24 hours, he would tear that entire department store apart just to find the girl who had saved his heart's only weakness. He didn't want to just thank her. He wanted to understand her. He wanted to know how someone with so little could be so fearless in the face of someone who had everything. This wasn't a fairy tale, it was a collision, and neither of them was prepared for the fire that was about to start. I stepped out of those revolving doors and into the biting Seoul wind, the weight of my termination letter heavy in my pocket. You know, they tell you that if you work hard and follow the rules, you'll make it. But they don't tell you that some rules are designed to strip away your humanity. My name is Amaka Okoye, just a Nigerian student trying to survive in a city that feels like it's made of glass and steel. And apparently, helping people too much is a fireable offense in the world of high-end retail. I looked at my reflection in a shop window. I didn't look like a rebel. I looked like a girl who was down to her last bowl of ramyun and a prayer. This was supposed to be the one, the job that finally paid the rent. My manager's voice was still ringing in my ears, a cold, sharp lecture about brand integrity and positional awareness. He looked at me like I was a stain on the marble floor. Just because I let a child's tears matter more than a display of Italian leather. I told myself that morning, just survive today. Don't be a hero. Just be a mannequin. But my heart has always been louder than my head. As I walked toward the subway, the frustration started to burn off, replaced by a hollow, aching vulnerability. But it's a terrifying thing to realize that your kindness is the very thing making you fail. I was broke. I was jobless, and I was thousands of miles from home. I felt small, so incredibly small, against the towering skyscrapers of Gangnam. I didn't know that back in that store, the silence was being shattered. I didn't know that the man in the charcoal suit was currently standing in the manager's office, his presence turning the air to ice. Kang Joon-Seok didn't yell. He didn't have to. The way he leaned against the mahogany desk, adjusting his watch with a slow, rhythmic precision, was more terrifying than any shout. He had found his daughter Sumin, and she had told him everything. She told him about the pretty lady who stayed when everyone else walked by. And when the manager proudly explained that he had handled the situation by firing me, Joon-Seok's eyes didn't just darken, they went dead. The atmosphere in that room shifted from corporate tension to pure, unadulterated dread. Joon-Seok wasn't just a billionaire. He was a man who viewed loyalty as the only currency that mattered, and I had shown it to his daughter for free. While I was counting my remaining coins at a bus stop, he was tearing down an empire to find me. He didn't want a secretary. He wanted the only person in this city who wasn't afraid to break the rules for the right reasons. The silence of the VIP wing was expensive, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. Then it broke. A thin, jagged sob drifted from behind a pillar of emerald marble. I froze. My heart didn't just beat. It thudded against my ribs like a trapped bird. If I move, I lose my job. If I don't, I lose something worse. It was a split-second war between survival and soul. I looked at the security camera pulsing with a tiny red eye, then at the empty hallway where my manager's shadow lurked. But the crying grew sharper, more desperate. I turned my back on the rules. I walked away from my post, away from my paycheck, and into a moment that would rewrite my entire life. I found her tucked behind a display of crystalline perfume bottles. She looked like a fallen flower, tiny, crumpled, and terrified. Her name, I'd later learn, was Sumin, but in that moment she was just a soul in need of a harbor. I didn't just stand there. I knelt. I let my knees hit the hard cold floor because I needed to be on her level. And I needed her to see that I wasn't an authority. I was a friend. "Hey," I whispered, my voice thick with a softness I didn't know I still possessed in this harsh city. "I've got you. You're not alone." Her tiny, trembling fingers reached out and wrapped around mine. The trust was instant, an electric current of pure vulnerability that made my breath hitch. Her grip was so small, yet it held the weight of a world I wasn't prepared to enter. As I wiped a stray tear from her cheek, I felt a strange, quiet echo in the air. A heavy masculine presence I couldn't see but could certainly feel. It was as if the very atmosphere of the store had shifted, growing dense with an unspoken gravity. I didn't call for security. I didn't hand her off to a stranger. I stood up, her small hand anchored in mine, and began to walk. We moved through the aisles of gold and glass, two outsiders navigating a kingdom of excess. I ignored the frantic glares of my coworkers and the rising heat of my own anxiety. For the first time since I arrived in Seoul, I wasn't a struggling student or a failing employee. I was a protector. I was walking her straight back to her father, unaware that I was hand delivering my heart to a man who had forgotten how to feel one beat. The peace I had built for Sumin lasted exactly 60 seconds. Then the glass palace shattered. The manager's voice didn't just rise, it curdled the air, sharp and hysterical, as he rounded the corner with a face flushed a deep, ugly purple. He didn't see the trembling child clutching my hand. He only saw a break in his perfect, profitable formation. "What are you doing?" he hissed, the words spraying like venom. "You abandoned your post. Do you have any idea what those leather bags cost? More than your entire life is worth." He grabbed my shoulder to pull me away, his fingers digging into my cheap blazer. I felt the heat rise from my chest. Not the heat of embarrassment, but the cold, steady fire of a woman who had finally found her limit. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down at my scuffed shoes or offer the stuttering apology he expected. I stepped between him and the girl, breaking his grip with a sharp, controlled motion that made his eyes widen. "She was terrified," I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous resonance that surprised even me. "While you were counting inventory, she was crying for help. If this store values a handbag over a human heart, then you aren't just a manager, you're a failure." The silence that followed was suffocating. The wealthy patrons paused, their polished faces turning toward us like spectators at a car crash. I could see the exact moment he decided to destroy me. It was in the way his lip curled and the petty man exerting the only power he had. "You're done," he spat, leaning in until I could smell that his expensive coffee. "Pack your things. Don't even think about a reference. In this city, you're officially a ghost." I looked at Sumin one last time. Her eyes were wide, mirrored with the guilt no child should carry. I squeezed her hand, a final silent promise, before letting go. I didn't beg for my rent money. I didn't explain that I had 5,001 in my bank account. I adjusted my posture, pulled my shoulders back, and looked him dead in the eye. "If helping a child is wrong," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "then I'll be wrong again, every single time." I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't cry until I hit the humid air of the street. Behind me, the luxury of the Lotte store felt like a tomb. I was jobless, I was adrift, and the terrifying reality of Seoul was closing in. But as the revolving doors clicked shut, I felt a strange electric prickle on the back of my neck. I didn't know that from the shadow of the mezzanine, a pair of dark predatory eyes had watched the entire exchange, and for the first time in his life, Kang Joon-Seok was impressed. The rain began as a taunt, a cold, needle-like drizzle that blurred the neon lights of Seoul into jagged streaks of neon pink and toxic blue. My heart was still thundering, a frantic drumbeat against the hollow ache in my stomach. I was moving through the crowd like a ghost, blind to the luxury around me, until the world suddenly turned into a wall of expensive wool and the scent of cedarwood and cold iron. I slammed into him hard. The impact jarred my teeth, sending my meager belongings skittering across the wet pavement. I looked up, ready to snap, my frustration finally boiling over. He stood there, a towering silhouette of absolute, terrifying stillness. He didn't stumble. He didn't even flinch. He just looked down at me with eyes that felt like a winter storm, gray, piercing, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Watch where you're going," I snapped, the words escaping before my brain could register the danger. I didn't see the tailored lines of his three-piece suit or the way the people around him had suddenly stopped breathing. I only saw another man in a suit who thought he owned the sidewalk. Maybe if this store spent less time polishing its floors and more time training its staff to be human, people wouldn't be so distracted. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't check for a wedding ring or a name tag. I just stooped, snatched my bag from the puddle, and pushed past him, my shoulder brushing his in a way that felt like a spark of static electricity. I felt his gaze on the back of my neck, heavy, predatory, and strangely focused. It was a weight that made the hair on my arms stand up, a gravity that seemed to pull the very air out of my lungs. I kept walking, losing myself in the sea of umbrellas, my heart hammering a new, a more dangerous rhythm. I was just a girl who had lost everything in a single afternoon. I was a nobody with a nearing expiration date on her visa and a bank account that mocked her dreams. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined as I ducked into the crowded subway entrance, was that I had just spoken to Kang Joon-Seok like he was ordinary. I had looked into the face of the man who decided which businesses lived and which ones died, and I had offered him nothing but my unfiltered, beautiful rage. For the first time in his life, someone had looked at the King of Seoul and didn't see a crown. She saw a man, and God help me, that was the moment he decided he was never going to let me go. The atmosphere inside the Lotte store didn't just change, it died. One moment, the air was filled with the artificial scent of expensive lilies and the soft chime of credit cards. The next, a heavy, suffocating stillness descended that made the very oxygen feel metallic. The massive gold-trimmed doors didn't just close, they locked. Security personnel in charcoal suits moved with a terrifying, silent synchronization, clearing the aisles like they were preparing for a war. The staff weren't just confused, they were paralyzed. I heard them whispering his name in the corridors, a frantic, jagged sound that felt more like a warning than a person. Kang Joon-Seok. To them, he wasn't a man. He was a natural disaster in a bespoke suit. He didn't storm into the manager's office. He simply appeared there, a shadow that had finally taken form. The manager, the same man who had looked at me with such casual cruelty only an hour ago, was now vibrating with a primal, naked fear. His face had gone from purple to a sickly, translucent gray. Joon-Seok didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the rain wash over the city he owned. The silence he projected was louder than any scream. "So," Joon-Seok said, his voice a low melodic rasp that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "You found it inconvenient that a woman stopped to save my daughter's life? You found her compassion unprofessional?" The manager tried to speak, a pathetic wet sound catching in his throat, but Joon-Seok simply raised a hand. He didn't even look at him. He was looking at the security footage on the desk, a grainy, looped image of me kneeling on the marble floor, and my hand wrapped around Sumin's. He watched the way I shielded her, the way I stood my ground against the very man now begging for his professional life. In that room, the air grew so thin it felt like it might snap. Joon-Seok wasn't just angry, he was fascinated. He saw the fire in my eyes through the digital screen, a spark of defiance he hadn't encountered in a decade. He didn't just want the store shut down, he wanted the woman who had walked away from his world without a backward glance. "Find her," he commanded, the words final and absolute, "and make sure she understands that in this city, no one walks away from me until I say so." I didn't get a phone call. I got a shadow. Two men in black suits were waiting outside my cramped apartment, their presence turning my neighborhood of peeling paint and Tangram Tango power lines into a crime scene. They didn't ask, they escorted. And 20 minutes later, I was standing in an office that felt more like a glass cathedral suspended over the glowing veins of Seoul. The silence here was different. It wasn't the empty silence of my room. It was the heavy, charged quiet of a predator waiting for its prey to stop moving. Then he turned around. Kang Joon-Seok didn't just look at me. He held me still. His gaze was a physical weight, a dark velvet pressure that seemed to strip away my cheap coat and my tired defenses until there was nothing left but the truth of who I was. Up close, he was devastating. His features were carved from something harder than marble. His mouth a straight but uncompromising line that looked like it hadn't smiled in a decade. "You're the one," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the very center of my chest. He didn't move toward me, yet I felt like the space between us was vanishing. He studied the way I stood, my chin tilted, my shoulders braced for a blow that hadn't come. My daughter hasn't stopped talking about the woman who wouldn't let go of her hand. My manager, however, hasn't stopped shaking since I told him he was unemployed. He took a single step forward, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catching the sharp edge of his jaw. "You don't seem afraid, Amaka Okoye. Most people in this city start sweating the moment I say their name." I took a breath, the scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something dangerously cold, filling my lungs. "Should I be?" I asked, my voice steady despite the frantic rhythm of my heart. "I've already lost my job today. Unless you're planning on taking the roof over my head, you don't have much left to threaten me with." That's when it happened. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something dark and hungry behind those flint gray eyes. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. It was as if I had just become a problem he had no intention of solving, but every intention of keeping. "I don't want to take anything from you," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, becoming intimate, dangerous, He reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of his mahogany desk, never breaking eye contact. I want to put you where I can see you. My daughter needs a guardian, and I need a secretary who isn't blinded by my bank account. The salary is 10 times what you earned at that store. The catch? You belong to my schedule, day and night. The air in the room spiked with a sudden electric tension. It wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation into the eye of the storm. And as I looked into the eyes of the most feared man in the country, I realized the safe life I had been mourning was officially dead. My first week in his world didn't feel like a job. It felt like a slow, deliberate drowning. The office of Kang Joon-Seok was a fortress of glass and silence, where every whispered command moved markets and every footfall felt like an ultimatum. I was no longer the girl scrubbing marble. I was the shadow to a man who cast no shadow of his own. But it was the quiet moments, the spaces between the high-powered meetings and the frantic phone calls, where the air truly began to thicken. He was always watching. I'd be organizing his digital calendar or briefing him on a merger, and I'd look up to find those flint gray eyes anchored on me. He didn't look at me like an employee. He looked at me like a riddle he was determined to solve. Once, when I tripped over a complex Korean honorific in a report, he didn't scold me. He didn't even speak. He simply reached over my shoulder, his chest nearly brushing my back, and corrected the line with a fountain pen. The scent of him, expensive tobacco and cold rain, swirled around me, and for a heartbeat, the entire room vanished. Every time he stood behind me like that, leaning in just a fraction too close, I forgot how to breathe properly. The tension wasn't just in the boardroom, it was in the way his daughter, Sumin, became my constant shadow. The moment I arrived at the penthouse, she would sprint across the polished floors, her face lighting up in a way that seemed to melt the ice in the room. "Uni!" she cried, her small arms wrapping around my waist. She clung to me with a desperate, pure sort of love, as if she knew I was the only thing keeping her father grounded in his own humanity. I'd catch Joon-Seok watching us from the doorway, his silhouette dark against the city lights. His expression would soften just for a ghost of a second before the mask of the billionaire king slid back into place. He saw the way I handled his child with the same fierce, on-board kindness that had cost me my job, and I saw the way it unnerved him. He was used to buying loyalty. He didn't know what to do with a woman who gave it for free. Our world was becoming a dangerous dance of proximity. A hand lingering too long on a handed over file. A look that lasted a second past professional. I was supposed to be his secretary, but as the elevators hummed and the city glittered below us, I realized I was becoming the only thing in his life he couldn't control. The meeting wasn't held in a glass tower. It was tucked away in a dimly lit, private lounge where the smell of expensive cognac couldn't quite mask the scent of impending betrayal. The air was thick, heavy, with the kind of tension that makes your skin itch. I stood just behind Joon-Seok's shoulder, a silent witness to a deal that was souring with every passing second. Across the table, a man whose empire was crumbling reached into his coat, not for a pen, but for something that caught the low light with a dull, lethal glint. Time didn't just slow down, it shattered. Before the metal could even clear his pocket, my body moved. It wasn't thought, it was the raw, primal instinct of someone who had spent her life surviving. I stepped into his space, my hand locking around his wrist with a strength that surprised even the man holding the weapon. With the sharp, practiced twist I'd learned back home, the gun clattered to the floor, sliding across the polished wood like a discarded toy. The silence that followed was deafening. Security swarmed, but Joon-Seok didn't move. He didn't even stand up. He just sat there, his fingers steepled, watching me with an intensity that felt more dangerous than the gun. When I finally looked up, panting, my hair falling across my face, he wasn't angry, but he wasn't shocked. He looked impressed. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something truly human in his eyes, a dark, sparking admiration that made my knees feel weaker than the adrenaline ever could. Once the room was cleared, the stillness that remained was intimate, suffocating in its proximity. He stood up slowly, his shadow stretching over me until I was completely eclipsed by his presence. "You could have been hurt," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to my soul. I wiped a stray hair from my forehead, a small defiant smirk tugging at my lips despite the tremor in my hands. So could he, I countered. He didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing the underside of my wrist, where my pulse was still hammering a frantic rhythm. It was a ghost of a touch, a momentary contact that felt like a brand. His skin was warm, a searing contrast to the cold iron of the world he lived in. He lingered there for a heartbeat too long, his thumb grazing the delicate blue veins, and in that second the air between us caught fire. I wasn't just his secretary anymore. I was the only person who had ever fought for him without being paid to do it. It started with a whisper that felt like a prophecy. We were sitting on the floor of the penthouse, the city lights of Seoul bleeding through the glass like falling stars, when Sumin looked up from her drawings. Her small face was uncharacteristically serious as she tucked a stray braid behind my ear. "Oni," she murmured, her voice carrying that devastatingly innocent weight only a child can command. "You should just marry my daddy. Yeah, then you'd never have to go home." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was a physical weight. I could feel Joon-Seok's gaze from across the room, the rustle of his newspaper stopping mid-turn. I didn't dare look at him. My heart was thumping a frantic, guilty rhythm against my ribs, and for a second, the air in that multi-million-dollar apartment felt too thin to breathe. I tried to laugh it off, a shaky, breathless sound that fooled no one, least of all the man watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes. But the real breaking point came 2 nights later. I had agreed to a blind date, a desperate attempt to remind myself that I was a woman with a life, not just an extension of the Kang empire. We were at a quiet, dimly lit bistro, the kind of place where people go to be forgotten. I was halfway through a sentence when the atmosphere in the room curdled. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted. I didn't have to turn around to know it was there. The scent of cedarwood and cold iron arrived seconds before it did. Joon-Seok didn't make a scene. He simply pulled out the chair next to us and sat down, his presence instantly eclipsing the man across from me. He looked devastatingly casual in a black turtleneck, his shadow stretching long and predatory across the white tablecloth. "You didn't tell me you were busy tonight, Amaka," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that made the wine in my glass tremble. He didn't look at my date. He didn't have to. He looked only at me, his gaze anchored on my lips with a possessive intensity that felt like a hand around my throat. You shouldn't be here with him, he murmured. The words meant only for my ears. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a claim. He proceeded to dismantle the evening with a surgical, quiet arrogance, answering questions I wasn't asked, ordering a vintage I didn't want, and making it vibrantly clear that my time was no longer my own. I should have been furious. I should have stood up and walked out on his overbearing billionaire ego. But as I looked into those flint gray eyes, burning with a jealousy he couldn't quite mask, my heart did something reckless. It didn't break, it leaned in. I realized then that the safety of an ordinary life was a lie I could no longer tell myself. I didn't want to be with someone who treated me like a person. Yet I wanted to be with the man who looked at me like I was his entire world, and he was willing to burn the rest of it down just to keep me in his sight. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a blurred smear of neon and rain, but inside the office, the silence was a living, breathing thing. The only light came from the amber glow of a single desk lamp, casting long, sharp shadows that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, like a confessional. I stood by the glass, my reflection ghost-like against the storm, while Joon-Seok remained in the darkness behind me. I could feel the heat of his presence, a magnetic pull that made the air between us feel heavy and electric. Why me? I finally whispered, the question I'd been carrying like a stone in my heart for months. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Out of everyone in this city who would kill to be in my position, why did you choose a girl who didn't even have a job 3 hours after meeting you? The silence stretched agonizingly slow until I heard the quiet scuff of his leather shoes on the rug. He didn't stop until he was standing directly behind me, so close I could feel the steady warmth of his chest radiating through my silk blouse. He didn't touch me, but the proximity was a physical ache. Because he began, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver racing down my spine. You looked at me like I wasn't someone to fear. In a world where everyone either wants something from me or is terrified of what I'll do next, you just looked at me. You saw a man, Amaka, not a bank account, not a title. I turned then, all my breath catching as I found myself trapped between the cold glass and the furnace of his gaze. His eyes didn't just look at me. They searched me, tracing the line of my jaw, the pulse fluttering at the base of my throat before anchoring back on my own. The predatory coldness I'd first seen in him was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that made my heart stutter. And now he murmured, his hand rising to rest on the glass beside my head, effectively caging me in. I can't stop looking back. I find myself searching for you in every room. I find myself listening for your voice in the middle of meetings that used to be my entire life. You've become the only thing I can't calculate, the only variable I can't control. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, the scent of expensive bourbon and cold rain wrapping around us like a shroud. I could see the slight tremor in his hand, a crack in the billionaire's armor that told me more than 1,000 words ever could. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The rain against the glass, the hum of the city, the weight of our separate lives, it all vanished. There was only the heat of his breath on my lips and the terrifying, beautiful realization that I was no longer just his secretary. I was his gravity. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing in the boardroom. The threats weren't whispers anymore, they were headlines. Joon-Seok's enemies had found his pulse and they knew it beat for the woman who sat at his desk and the child who called her Oni. I walked into his study to find him standing by the glass, his silhouette a jagged blade against the lightning. He didn't turn around. He didn't even look at me when he spoke, his voice sounding like gravel, grinding over silk. You're leaving, Amaka. There's a plane waiting at Incheon. You and Sumin. You'll be safe in Lagos before the sun comes up. The words hit me like a physical blow, cold and clinical. He was trying to cut me out of his life like a diseased limb, his protective instinct twisting into something cruel and isolating. I didn't cry, I didn't flinch. I walked right into the center of his space, the scent of his stress, bitter coffee, and expensive tobacco filling my senses. No, I said, the syllable dropping into the room like a stone into a steel pool. He spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The mask of the billionaire king finally cracked wide open. You don't understand. These people, they don't play by the rules. They'll use you to get to me. I can't have your blood on my hands, Amaka. I can't lose the only thing that makes me feel human. I stepped closer until the tips of my shoes touched his, forcing him to look down into my face. You don't get to decide that for me, Joon-Seok. You don't get to play God with my life just because you're afraid of losing yours. I reached out, my fingers curling into the lapels of his charcoal suit, anchoring myself to him. I chose to stay when Sumin was crying in that store, and I'm choosing to stay now. You think you're protecting me by sending me away. You're just making me a target in a different city. He gripped my wrists, his touch almost painful in his desperation, a silent plea for me to just listen, to just run. But I didn't budge. I saw the fear in him, the deep primal terror of a man who had finally found something worth keeping and realized he didn't know how to guard it. If you're dangerous, I whispered, my voice vibrating with a fierce, unwavering certainty, then I'll be dangerous with you. If they want to get to you, they have to go through me first. And believe me, Kang Joon-Seok, I've survived much worse than your enemies. For a heartbeat, he looked like he might break. Then his grip softened, his hands sliding up my arms to cup my face with a reverence that made my breath hitch. The tension between us snapped, replaced by a devastating, quiet surrender. He didn't push me away. He pulled me in, his forehead resting against mine as the rain lashed against the glass. We weren't boss and employee. We weren't billionaire and student. We were two souls standing in the eye of the storm, refusing to let go. The chaos didn't end with a bang. It ended with the hum of the city returning to a rhythmic, peaceful pulse. The threats had been dismantled, the enemies silenced, and the fortress of the Kang Empire felt for the first time like a home instead of a bunker. We were back in the penthouse, the early morning light filtering through the glass in pale, buttery streaks that washed over the ivory rugs. The silence was broken by the pitter-patter of small feet. Sumin didn't run this time. She walked slowly into the center of the room, looking from me to her father with an ancient, knowing look in her eyes. She reached out, taking my hand in her left and Joon-Seok's in her right, physically bridging the gap that pride and fear had built between us. She didn't say a word. But the way she squeezed our fingers was a command more powerful than any board mandate. Joon-Seok looked down at her, his expression finally shedding the jagged edges of the Alpha King. He looked tired, stripped of his armor, but more present than I had ever seen him. He turned his gaze to me, the flinty gray of his eyes warming into something deep, dark, and utterly consumed. He didn't reach for his checkbook or his phone. He reached for my waist, pulling me into the circle of his warmth with a slow, deliberate gravity. "Stay," he murmured, the word vibrating against my temple. It wasn't a demand, it was a prayer. I looked up at him, my heart finally finding its steady rhythm in the curve of his embrace. "In what capacity, Joon-Seok?" "On the contract for the secretary position ended yesterday." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first real one I had ever seen. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Not as my employee Amaka, never again. I don't want someone who follows my orders. I want someone who challenges them, someone who reminds me why the world is worth saving. Stay as mine, my partner, my equal, the woman who holds the heart I forgot I had." I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since that first day at the luxury store. I didn't pull away. I leaned into him, my fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. "I was never yours to command, Kang Joon-Seok," I whispered, my voice thick with the weight of everything we'd survived. "But I'm choosing you, not because of the glass towers or the name, but because you're the man who finally saw me." In that moment, the billionaire and the student vanished. There was only a family, forged in chaos and sealed by a single defiant act of kindness. The world would always be dangerous, but as he pulled me and Sumin into a single unbreakable embrace, I knew I was finally home. I walked out of that luxury store with nothing but a pink slip and the sting of humiliation on my cheeks, convinced my life had ended before it even began. I thought the world was a place where kindness was a currency no one accepted, and where being invisible was the only way to survive. I was wrong. I lost my job that day, but I found something far more dangerous. I found a man who could destroy the world with a single phone call. A man who moved through life like a storm, looking for a place to strike. He was the shadow everyone feared, the king who sat on a throne of glass and cold steel, untouchable and unloved. And yet, in the middle of all that power, he saw a girl who refused to bow. He saw a heart that wouldn't break. He could have crushed me. He could have replaced me. He could have wiped my name from this city without a second thought. But instead, he let me in. He let me see the scars behind the silk suits and the silence beneath the commands. He chose to trade his empire for my laughter and his solitude for our peace. He's still the most feared man in Korea. He's still the man the world handles with trembling hands. But when the doors close and the city lights fade into the distance, he is simply the man who holds me like I'm the only thing keeping the earth on its axis. I didn't just find a career, and I didn't just find a paycheck. I found a love that was never supposed to exist. A love that started with a crying child and ended with a promise that will never be broken. He is a man who could destroy the world, but he chose to love me instead.